what we expect the world to be going through in the coming years, if we do not deal with the issues mindfully and with a positive approach, our survival, even as a human race, will be affected. So unless we are mindful, realistic in our approach, it'll really be difficult for us to cope with all the challenges that we will be seeing in years to come. And when we do our environmental work, we need to ensure that there is a fun part of it. We need to believe in it, see the value of it. And maybe when you are more mindful, you are less drawn by materialistic things and more by experiences, which will make you also more harmonious in your approach towards life and towards the environment. So I think positive psychology really fills a great gap when we discuss the climate crisis and can help us solve a lot of our problems in the future.
Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. What are the earthkeeping challenges in a place where human beings have been impacting the environment since the Paleolithic era? And how does one think about restoring nature in a place known as the cradle of civilization? Well, in this episode, we're going to gain some practical wisdom from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And for that perspective, we welcome Mohammad Asfour, founding chair of WADI, an organization that advances water conservation and land stewardship practices in Jordan. He's also an environmentally conscious businessman and a skilled nature photographer, and I'm glad to have him with me. Mohammad, welcome to the podcast. By way of introduction, could you describe some of the main projects and organizations that you're involved in these days?
So I've been involved in environmental activism for about 2 decades now. Currently, I chair an NGO called WADI that's all about ecosystem restoration. I'm also involved in an initiative called Ahl al-Balad, which is all about spreading positivity in community through volunteering.
I'd really like to hear first about your environmental restoration work. And I wonder if you could describe that work and maybe give some examples of the changes that you're helping to bring about.
I think the first time I got involved in reforestation was back in 2010 when I was asked to revive Jordan's Arbor Day celebration. During that year, we planted about 30,000 trees in 6 different locations around the Kingdom of Jordan within 2 weeks only. And each of these events was under the patronage of a member of the royal family here in Jordan. Now, since 2018, I've been chairing an NGO called WADI, which I'll be talking more about today.
So WADI is essentially about sustainable ecosystems development, but why did WADI shift from providing plants to organizations to actually doing the work that you're doing today, the actual involvement in the restoration work?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think it's really important to note that since its inception, WADI has been involved in restorative planting in addition to providing high-quality native plants. Now, while providing these high-quality native plants contribute to ecosystem restoration, we feel that actively engaging in restorative planting represents a more holistic approach towards environmental conservation, which is essential for long-term sustainability and biodiversity conservation. Restorative planting requires a long-term commitment to ensure the survival and growth of the species we plant. Therefore, it demonstrates our dedication to ecosystem restoration over an extended period, which is really crucial for achieving our restoration goals, allows for adaptation to changing environmental conditions. Now, as ecosystems evolve and face new challenges, we can adjust our strategies and species selection to better support the ecosystem's resilience. And remember, now we are in an age of climate change. Restoration is an opportunity also for educating people and engaging them, and it involves a lot of collaboration with local communities and volunteers. By actively engaging them all in the planting projects we have, we can build strong bonds with the communities we work with them and encourage collective action for environmental conservation. This engagement can lead, of course, to more sustainable behaviors and will help us advocate for environmental protection.
Could you give us a sense of what maybe a typical project might look like, the kinds of things you're doing on the ground?
We manage several nurseries around the kingdom which produce native plants. Now, depending on where the restoration takes place, we start our planning through collecting seeds from a similar environment. It takes about a year for them to germinate, and then we usually plant them in the selected site in collaboration with the local communities. So wherever we function, we have someone from the local community working with us. We also work with CBOs and so on. And they help, of course, in preserving the site in the long term.
So you noted a couple of things that are really interesting to me. First, you said that you're collecting seeds from similar habitats or similar environments. And I think that brings up the question of microclimates, that the approach to reforestation or restoration can't be generic, right? It's got to be based on deep understanding of a particular place. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And also, you listen to people clearly, the locals, and I'm wondering, how is that important in terms of the work that you do, both listening to the land in terms of the particular environment, but also listening to the people who live in that environment?
Okay, so let me maybe start with the microclimate question. And I think it's very important to understand the microclimate in order to make informed decisions within various contexts. So microclimates can vary significantly, even within a small area. Affecting factors include temperature, humidity, sunlight, wind patterns, and so on. So we really need to understand these specific microclimatic conditions. And then we need to ensure that the right native plants or indigenous plants are selected for optimal growth and survival, since different types of plants thrive in different environmental conditions. Microclimates can also influence local precipitation patterns and water availability and so on. So by considering the microclimate, we can choose plants that are adapted to local water conditions. And remember, Jordan is the second most deprived country in the world when it comes to water resources. So this can really help us conserve water and reduce the need for irrigation, which is really crucial in Jordan's case. Now, microclimates can also affect soil temperature, moisture level, nutrient availability, and so on. And these factors influence the health of soil and also the microorganisms that live within soil ecosystems. So again, planting the right species in the right microclimate can promote a healthier soil, which is essential for plant growth. And now in an age of climate change, we realize that climate change is causing shifts in microclimates, making it even more critical to pay attention to this changing context. Now, you also asked me about listening to the land and listening to the people and how that works. Now, you know that listening to local people is really essential for the success and sustainability of any restoration project, be it in Jordan, be it in the Amazon, be it anywhere in the world, because it helps us tap into local knowledge. It also builds community support. It enhances project feasibility. It helps us understand and respect cultural values and fosters long-term stewardship of the restoration site. Now, if we ignore or disregard local perspectives, we will most probably face resistance, and we will certainly fail to meet community needs, and we will struggle then to achieve our ecological and conservation goals. So we really need to work with local communities and understand their perceptions as well. Now, it's really important to work with local communities because they often possess valuable knowledge about the land itself, its history, and its natural resources. I was in southern Jordan in a very arid zone, desert, and a professor of archaeology led me to an olive press. And he was telling me, he was from that region, he was telling me that 700 or 800 years ago, this environment sustained enough olive trees to produce olive oil. So imagine the shift in the environment. But if I hadn't met that professor who was from that region, I wouldn't have known that there were olive trees in this unhospitable environment.
I would imagine that part of the job of restoration might include some education as well, because it's not always clear in restoration projects, maybe even to the people who live there, what are the ultimate values, what are the ultimate goals that are being pursued. And so for someone, say, who is struggling to make a living with goat herding, for example, that might be difficult if they're allowing the goats to graze in the same place that the restoration is happening. I mean, the fact is our goats need to eat, right? And so that may interfere actually with the long-term sustainability goals of the project itself. So how do you actually convince people and even educate people about the goals of the project and even about the long-term sustainability factors?
I will not draw a rosy picture here because this is something that is really difficult to achieve, because in many cases, these herders would earn their livelihoods through grazing this land as they have done for maybe thousands of years. And because Jordan has been cradle of civilization and has been exploited by people for over thousands of years, the environment has been degraded to a great extent. And if we are to restore this environment and state whereby herders could still earn a living, we really need their buy-in. And this, of course, requires, on one hand, a lot of dialogue taking place, a lot of subject-subject dialogue. And having worked in the development field for many years, I don't think that his subject-object relationship ever works, because we really need to understand their concerns, understand their local knowledge, and where they come from. So education is one part of the formula, but the other is incentives. So if you come to a herder and say that, sorry, you cannot graze in this patch of land, what's the alternative you are providing them with? So there's also the economic factor that really needs to be considered. Just to reach the point where the ecosystem has been restored to the level under which they could graze again. And I think these few years are the most critical years after which the community should be involved in managing their pastures internally.
You know, in so many of these podcast conversations, I find that people who are committed to working for environmental concerns are oftentimes motivated in great part by their love of nature. I'm wondering if you could tell us about your relationship to nature and how that impacts various works that you're a part of.
I have a story to tell, I think. When I was 6 years old, my father decided that he was leaving the city and building a home on a family farm, which was in a suburb of the capital city of Jordan, Amman. But what happened in Amman is that it expanded so rapidly that civilization was approaching us quickly. So I remember when I was 6 years old, the municipality decided they wanted to expand the street in front of our house. So I just clung to a tree, and it was the first tree I ever hugged. And I still remember that day till this day. And it's been really important to me. When I was 9 years old, I started recording all the different birds I was seeing. Now, we are privileged in Jordan in being on the second most important bird drought in the world. So there is this possibility to see various types of birds. So when I was 9, I started recording them. My grandfather was also interested in farming on the side as a hobby. So we always used to go to farms outside the city and so on. So all of this, my parents, my upbringing, my grandfather, etc., all helped me maybe establish this bond with nature, which grew with time. So when I received my driving license, I used to go out to the wilderness, take photos. And I think there was a stage where I was seeing how urbanization was affecting nature. So I thought that I had to really document whatever I see. So I've ended up maybe with tens of thousands of photos of nature in Jordan, and I continue to do so till today.
So speaking of photos, I looked at some of your beautiful photographs, and I find some of them to be quite moving. Those images, they make it clear that photography is deeply connected to your work as someone who cares for the planet. Could you describe what the creation of photographic images means to you, and maybe what you hope your images might mean for those who look at them?
Yes, I think it's about bringing the beauty of nature to people, because not everyone has the time or the mindfulness to spend time looking for insects or birds or plants. So when you tell people that there is a different world out there, it helps also in a lot of our advocacy campaigns, like when we used to wage forest protection campaigns. These photos really made a difference when people started seeing how beautiful things are outside cities. And I remember once we had this advocacy campaign and we were at the Parliament. And a boss of mine who had become an MP was sitting next to me, and she showed me this photo. She said, "See, they're going to cut these trees." And this photo was a photo I had taken. So other than them being a tool to bring beauty to people who do not have the luxury of being out in nature, it was also very helpful as an advocacy tool whereby decision makers also saw maybe the potential in protecting this natural beauty and heritage.
One of the core beliefs that shape our podcast is that we all need to learn new ways of thinking and acting by listening to difference. That is, we become better earth keepers if and when we open ourselves to new understanding, new perspectives from a diversity of different cultures or geographies or religious traditions and histories. What are some of the perspectives that our listeners from all over the world can learn from Jordan?
I think one of the lessons that people within the region can learn from Jordan is the role of civil society. So I think Jordan was one of the few countries in the world whereby an NGO manages most of the nature reserves in the country. I'm referring to the Royal Society for the Conservation of Nature, of which I've been a member for many years. Now, this is a great example of how people coming together can make a difference. So within this NGO, we have a general assembly. We elect the leadership of the organization. The organization itself is responsible for protecting nature reserves. It also works very closely with local communities. So a lot of the staff come from the local community. It's helped local communities develop products and services that could earn them important revenues. So there are, in different reserves, there are different workshops that produce different natural products. It was able to introduce the concept of ecotourism and to an extent adventure tourism. So I think this is one of the important examples that could be shared as a better international practice and comes from Jordan.
It's interesting that you described that as one of the key values, that participatory governance, that participatory kind of influence. One of my students, Jawad Hadadin, he wrote his thesis about that very thing. And for me, what I learned from him was just how much Jordanians seem to value democracy in some ways. They value the capacity to influence things together, right? To come together, make decisions together. And I just was really struck by that because it's not something I would have associated with Jordan from the outside, but really learned from him about that value. And now you're saying that in terms of environment care, that's also a value there that seems to be in action, a dynamic.
Yes, I really respect Jawad's perspective on this issue. And I think the perception of Jordan from abroad doesn't always reflect reality, because Jordan is a product of so many different civilizations, from Greek to Roman to Islamic to Ottoman to Ayyubi to whatever civilizations that were here at one stage. So Jordan is the product of all of these civilizations. And I think people in Jordan are more expressive of their opinion than many others in the region, simply because it's part of their culture. And I've always thought that even within civil society, it's really important to have good governance practices, because without having those, we cannot have a thriving, sustainable civil society that could work hand in hand with decision makers, with ministries, or with whoever in advancing the green movement.
I definitely agree. There's a lot about the power of civil society that the rest of the world can learn from Jordan, I think. Thanks for sharing that with us. And speaking of our mutual admiration for Jawad's work in promoting civil society and good governance, we're going to take a quick break for a message that he has for our listeners.
السادة المستمعين، أسعد الله أوقاتكم بكل خير. This is Jawad Haddadin from Amman, Jordan. If you are a regular listener to this podcast, you'll know that Earthkeepers really value learning from lots of different perspectives. Practically speaking, that means that this podcast features guests from many places in the world. And that has a lot to do with the diversity of podcast listeners. In fact, at the time of this recording, Earthkeepers has listeners from 112 different countries. In just the last month, that audience has grown to include Czech Republic, Malaysia, the Faroe Islands, Bangladesh, and Brazil. In order to keep on featuring diverse points of view, we need your help. If you have an idea for an interesting podcast guest from wherever in the world you live, please go to the podcast website at earthkeepers.online and share your idea. For now, let's get back to the conversation with Mohammad Asfour.
So in terms of demographics, Jordan is, of course, a majority Muslim country. And I find myself curious to ask about the possible intersections between religious practice and creation care. In an earlier conversation that we had, you mentioned that in the history of Islamic thought and practice, there are examples of creation care that we might find inspiration in. Just wondering, what have you learned about the connections between Islam and earth care specifically?
Let me mention something I've been working on before I delve deeper into this question, just about the harmony of faith and religion in Jordan. So I recently helped the Ministry of Tourism in developing something they call the Christian Pilgrim Trail. So it starts from Mount Nebo and goes down to the baptism site. And along this trail, you can see how many civilizations lived in this place. You can see in the archaeology remains of all the monotheistic religions. So Jordan is in a way the birthplace of monotheistic faith. And Islam is an extension, of course, of Christianity and Judaism. This is how people in this part of the world look at it. Christianity and Judaism is also looked upon as part of our heritage. So there is this belief, and it's widespread. Now in Islam, there is this issue of custodianship. So God created earth and the universe and provided means of life for the survival of people, but God also entrusted them to take care of his creation. And there's a verse in Quran that translates into this: God has set up the earth for all beings, but weigh things equitably and skip not in the balance. So there is a balance that we need to take care of. Although this, from a religious perspective, was provided to human beings, it's not without a responsibility. So there is this concept that, of course, is an extension of monotheistic religions at the same place. So Jordan, in that sense, is a place of harmony, a place of understanding and peace and so on. But some of our problems is that a lot of these concepts of custodianship aren't always respected, which causes damage to our natural heritage.
Well, it's certainly the case in the U.S. There is a movement among Christians, among churches, of people trying to recover understandings from the source text, from the Bible, that actually would make us better earth keepers, right? Because I think on the one hand, perhaps you could say that scriptures have been twisted a bit or selectively used in a way that justifies environmental degradation and exploitation. On the other hand, there's an ignorance that people just don't actually know what the Bible says about earth care. And I wonder if that's actually the case in Jordan. That perspective that you just described of custodianship, are most people aware of that, or is that something that maybe has gotten lost, gotten hidden?
Unfortunately, even if many people are aware of this, they don't really practice these traditions. And I think this happens when you put on your survival hat and you ignore everything else. So yes, it's not something that is always respected, but we do in a lot of our campaigns focus on some of these religious values. And I remember a few years ago, we had this campaign whereby we had seedlings distributed to mosques and churches in Jordan as a reminder of the role of faith in protecting the environment.
I really love that. Yeah, that's inspirational. You know, when it comes to environmental action and earth advocacy, it's common to hear that nonprofits are doing the work, that government agencies are working in that sphere. What isn't so common is the idea of for-profit businesses joining forces in order to participate in earth care more effectively. Tell us about your work with businesses and the association that you're part of and what that group seeks to achieve.
So there are two examples. The first is the Jordan Green Building Council. And what happened at a certain stage with a lot of our advocacy campaigns, there was this belief that environment and the economy clash. So we had to prove that there is a future in a greener economy. And one of the ways through which we demonstrated this was through the creation of the Jordan Green Building Council, which was an association of companies working in the field of green buildings. So they could be contractors, material providers, architecture and engineering firms, and so on. They could also be lawyers. And the idea was to create a marketplace where you could encourage business happening between them and present an example for others to follow. So this was one of the examples. The other is I'm part of this global network called Nexus, which is based in New York. And we've been trying through our work together to highlight the importance of impact investing. So taking into account the social, environmental, and many aspects that should guide the investment decision. And I feel there's a big movement taking place in the private sector that could help lead a greener economic future.
In your view, I wonder how you think entrepreneurial thinking and strategy might help us solve some of the environmental challenges that we face today.
I think entrepreneurship could play a vital role. And I remember in 2004 when I founded the Queen Rania Center for Entrepreneurship based on the MIT model at the time, I was amazed by the ideas that came out from students. So all what it needs, I think, is creating a conducive environment in which people or entrepreneurial ideas could flourish. But I also am against spoon feeding. So I believe that entrepreneurs need to be realistic in their approach towards the market and respond in a way that would guarantee business opportunities succeeding. Because what in many cases, entrepreneurship has become a myth. So there is a solution in supporting entrepreneurship, but we really need to be market responsive and realistic in our approach to creating products and services that could help us solve our environmental and climate issues.
I am imagining that folks who might be involved in business in terms of listening to this podcast, and maybe they're wondering, what does that actually look like to orient enterprise, orient business in terms of earth care, in terms of making the earth a better place, while at the same time respecting the basic tenets of what makes business work?
I've been in this field for a long time, and I've seen solutions coming up. I've seen opportunities. I've seen so much happening. But I think what we are missing on is changing our behavior. Believing that there is a solution, that we can change the way in which we live, in the way we do business, in the way we travel, name it. There are so many opportunities, but a main barrier is our conventional behavior that is not really allowing us to benefit from these new technologies and new realities to the extent possible.
Now, you yourself are a business person, and I wonder if I could push you a bit to say, what does that actually look like in terms of the business involvement that you have?
I'm at a stage where I translate everything into carbon. When I drive my car, or I go from one location to another, when I travel to another country to speak. And in many cases, I'm not really happy with what I'm doing, but I'm trying to change it. And I try to also offset whatever impact I am causing, any harmful impact as an individual or as a company I'm causing. Now, also coming from a family business, it's not just about me. It's about others. So convincing others within your family business or within your company is really challenging because they are, in many cases, part of this ecosystem which does not always see value in changing the approach. So for me, I think this is the main stumbling block. But as we move more towards a greener economy, a circular economy, call it whatever you wish, hopefully they will start seeing more opportunity in changing conventional ways of doing business.
Really, what you're talking about is fundamentally culture change, and cultures do not get changed very easily. There's lots of resistance to that, but it sounds like you're hopeful about that it's possible. And part of that hope depends on showing people the benefits, showing people the outcomes of the changed behaviors. Am I hearing that correctly?
That is 100% correct.
Well, now, in terms of your core values, you ascribe to beliefs in the power of positivity that you said at the beginning of our interview, and you draw from the field of positive psychology in your writing and your speaking. Tell us what that actually is. What's the essence of your thinking, and how does it make a difference in your work?
A few weeks ago, I was in Vancouver at the International Positive Psychology Conference, where I spoke about tackling the climate crisis from a place of positivity. And I think this is extremely important because taking into account what we expect the world to be going through in the coming years, if we do not deal with the issues mindfully and with a positive approach, our survival, even as a human race, will be affected. Take an example of what happened in Libya recently with the flash floods that occurred there and the thousands of deaths that occurred in one city due to rainfall. So unless we are mindful, realistic in our approach, it'll really be difficult for us to cope with all the challenges that we will be seeing in years to come. Now, I had mentioned the importance of behavior and maybe the importance of hacking what we call the habit loop. We really need to create different habit loops. We need to think carbon, as I mentioned earlier. And when we do our environmental work, we need to ensure that there is a fun part of it. We need to believe in it, see the value of it. And I think it's really fulfilling when you see all these young people feeling a responsibility towards Earth and towards the future generations. It makes you really feel positive. And maybe when you are more mindful, you are less drawn by materialistic things and more by experiences, which will make you also more harmonious in your approach towards life and towards the environment. So I think positive psychology really fills a great gap when we discuss the climate crisis and can help us solve a lot of our problems in the future.
You know, in the context where I teach, I do actually get to teach some psychology courses, especially psychology in relation to culture. I will say, though, that most of my psychology students really are thinking about psychology with an orientation toward individual healing, right? I mean, the practice that they're aiming to participate in once they get their education tends to be more about one-on-one therapy. I think what you're talking about is a psychology that's very much oriented toward larger groups, perhaps whole societies. Is that correct?
Correct. And we applied this to an initiative here in Jordan. So in 2013, we launched an initiative called Ahl al-Balad, which means people of the place. Now, 2 years later, we were observing some of the photos while we were reassessing our strategy. And we saw that a lot of the people who were joining us were really happy. And you know that people are happy when you see something called the Duchenne smile, which is a genuine smile that indicates that people are genuinely happy. So we changed our approach and applied principles of positive psychology to our initiative. And we decided that this will be a movement that will help spread positivity in society through volunteerism. And now, if you come and join us on a cleanup campaign, you can see the amount of happiness that occurs. It happens because there's this connectedness between people who join. There's this feeling of satisfaction for making a difference. Now, we know that if we hold as many campaigns as possible, we will not be able to solve the littering problem on our own. But at least we can help change behavior, and our members could also enjoy the experience while they're doing it. So there is this application of positive psychology on a community level, which I feel has a lot of potential if applied correctly.
It makes me wonder about a concern I have, think about quite often, and that is, especially among younger generations, there seems to be quite a bit of despair. And if it's not outright despair, it's perhaps numbness that people are just trying to avoid thinking about the future that lies before them. Do you think this positive thinking, positive psychology approach has any bearing on that particular issue, maybe especially among young folks?
Totally. And I think one aspect, there's a strong relationship between mindfulness and positive psychology. So by learning how to be mindful, you're learning how to be realistic, to accept things the way they are, and then act accordingly. As with the entrepreneurship, it's the same case with positive psychology. The same word means different things to different people. And I think sometimes people shield themselves from reality by pretending to be positive, and that's not about being positive. Being positive is about being open and realistic and accepting things the way they are, and then trying to change them and set the intention to create change. So there's a big link between having the young generation understand what's going on and encouraging them to make a difference, because if we do not deal with the climate crisis, with environmental challenges appropriately, then things would not be as positive as we hope them to be.
I know that for some of my psychology students, they would be very interested to learn more about this, but I think in general, this is an intriguing concept, positivity. And I wonder how might listeners learn more about it if they actually want to pursue that?
Yes. Now, in general, it's a new field that requires a lot of research. So the amount of research there, I think, needs much more work. But there are many authors who've written in this field. So I can mention here people like Martin Seligman, Barbara Friedrichsen, who taught me. She came up with the positivity ratio theory. Then there's Dr. Tayyab Rashid, who also worked with Professor Seligman and so on. So there are a lot of scholars now who are changing the way we look at psychology in general. And I think there's a great opportunity to learn from those people and also to build your own research, because there's still a lot that needs to be verified and proven scientifically. So yes, a lot to be done.
When it comes to our climate future, I'm wondering how this applies to you personally. I want to ask, are you hopeful? But that's not exactly the question I want to get at. Maybe I should say, in the face of all the challenges that we face today, what is it that sustains you, motivates you, keeps you pressing on in the work of Earth Care?
I think when I'm in nature and I observe wildlife, I indulge into that natural world, see what could be lost. I feel this sense of responsibility sometimes things might seem frustrating, but then you need to sustain that drive. And part of the sustenance comes through being with people who share your passion, such as you, for example, and who feel we can still make a difference. And this is why surrounding ourselves with people who share this passion is extremely important as well.
We've been in conversation with Mohammad Asfour, a thought leader and environmental advocate. To learn more about his work and to see some of his beautiful photos, just follow the links in this episode's show notes, and you'll find those on our new website at earthkeepers.online. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our producer is Dave Wolfers. Timothy Connor is our editor, and Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Colleen Meggerly, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.